How are you going? Hume here again. So, like everybody else today, I looked at and thoroughly enjoyed the short clip coming out of the budget debate where Mr. Coleman was questioning Mr. Roger Alexander pertaining to something about vehicle maintenance, and the discussion went on about the most and state enterprises, and then it all ended in a flourish with the National Security Minister uttering his now famous phrase, half of the most could be the most. Alright? And while for the most part that is one of those things that you could laugh at it, you could enjoy it, you could spin it into your conversations, you could sing songs about it. Look out for the Calypso next year, right? You could slip it into a regular conversation. You could do whatever you wanted it, but you wouldn't really take it seriously because something about it tells you that ain't making no sense. It doesn't make any sense. Even before you get deep into the mathematics of it, something will tell you, well, if it's half of the most, how it could be the most? Right? And for the most part, that is true. We know it makes sense, and that's a big part of the reason why we find it so funny. However, being as we are in 2025, in the age of social media and people saying all kind of things, and listen, man, you will be surprised, shocked even at the kinds of things that people just believe just because their friend tell them, or just because they see it from a podcast or some person that they like on YouTube say it, some random person on Instagram or something say something and you run with that. Yeah, people doing that. It amazes me the kind of foolishness people believe, right? And because I am aware of that, I know that somewhere, somehow, somebody is either, best case scenario, confused. They ain't sure. They're wondering if it is possible that half of the most could be the most. That is the best case scenario. And on the other end of the stick, the worst case scenario is that they actually believe it. And they might not just believe it, they might accept it with a kind of enthusiasm that, quite frankly, could be dangerous. And then they go out and they might be the kind of people who could make what they're saying sound sensible to people who are less informed than them, right? And next thing you know, yeah, this happened. As silly as it sounds to most of us, there are people out here, right in this country right now, who either confused about half or the most being the most, or somehow they tell themselves, yeah boy, half of the most could be the most. So because of that, I taken the time to say, well, alright, let me just throw out something there. It's a good opportunity for me to get back into the game in terms of producing video content and thing. I haven't put out anything new for a while, right? You know how things just be sometimes, right? So from a mathematical standpoint, we need to examine what we mean when we say the most and what we mean when we say half and what we mean when we say half of the most, right? And then we examine the question, is it possible mathematically that half of the most could possibly be the most? Right? So we know what half is. We all know what half is. We don't have to spend 5 minutes explaining what half is. We have a diagram here. We have a whole circle. That is the whole. We run a line down the center. We have half on the left side and half on the right side. Half, as we like to say. Right? Half and half, as we like to say too. Right? We know instinctively, we know by life experience, we know by some degree of mathematical training that once we're talking half, we're talking equal. We have two sides and both of the sides equal. We also know that if one of those sides suddenly become a little more than the other side, now we enter in a situation where we could have a more than and a less than. Or, depending on the circumstance, we could say one side is the most as opposed to the other side. Right? So maybe that is where the reference to half came from Mr. Alexander. Because listen, if you listen to the exchange between him and Mr. Imbert, there was nothing in that conversation about a half. Nobody was talking about a half, no way, no how. They were just talking about the vehicle maintenance, the state enterprises, and how it's going to be conducted, blah, 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 the most, whatever, whatever. And Mr. Imbert was there trying to make sure that what it is Mr. Alexander was saying was what it is he was saying. And then somewhere in there, Mr. Alexander said, well, half of the most could be the most, and everybody burst out laughing. And yes, Mr. Alexander has been having a very good time in the House, in the budget debate, right? A lot of funny quips and things. Yeah, but again, in the midst of the fun, from a mathematical standpoint, I just thought about it a little bit. And because people believe in all kind of nonsense online these days, I take the time to just explain it a little bit, right? So, half. Once you cross this line, you could be considered as the most. So in other words, if we consider, and again we're using an example, simple example, 100, and we could use 100 because 100 is the figure that we use anytime we're talking about percentages. And since the conversation emanated out of the budget debate, and you know in a budget debate you always have a lot of percentages and things, right? So let me go with percentages for demonstrative purposes. To be considered the most, you have to cross the 50% threshold, right? So as early as 50.01, for example, or 50.1 or 51 or whatever it is. Once you're over 50, you could be considered the most. Yeah? So in other words, to be the most, your M has to be greater than 50. Let me block this off so you can see it clearer, right? M for most, right? So the most, it had to be greater than 50. Not equal to 50, because at 50, you're half, you're not the most. Right? You're equal at 50. If you actually increase to 100, because that is as far as you could go, because 100 is the whole. So you can be greater than 100. At 100, you are now the whole, so to speak. Which means you have nothing else. So the whole concept of a most doesn't exist if you're at 100. 100 is all, you see? At 100, you're talking about all. So in other words, to be the most, you have to be greater than 50, but you also have to be less than 100. You can't be equal to 100. So to be considered any kind of majority or the most or whatever it is, you have to be between 50 and 100. So at 99, 99.5, 99.8, whatever it is, yeah, you're the most. And as close to 100 as you could get without actually being equal to 100. That is the most. So, M, you have to be greater than 50, but you also have to be less than 100. This here now, if we want to get technical with the maths, we start talking about inequalities, right? Because when M is equal to 50, that is half. When M is equal to 100, that is all. Anything between those two extremes is most. So you're greater than 50 and you're less than 100. We could combine these two in one line. That is what we refer to in maths as an inequality. Right? I just thrown it out. Yeah? So we know what half is. This is one example of the most. This line could be anywhere between here and we're going straight up to the top there, right? So I just choose a random position for the line to demonstrate the fact that we actually over the 50. So now in blue here, we are considered the most, all right? Which then brings us to the next part of the conversation now, where we're talking about half of the most. So if your most is 60, then half of your most is 30. If your most is 70, half of the most is 35. If the most is 80, half of the most is 40. If the most is 90, half of the most is 45, etc., etc., etc. So if you get as close to 100 as you could get, if your most is 99, right, then half of the most is 99 divided by 2 is 49 and a half, right? 99 divided by 2 is 49 and a half. So half of the most of 99 is 49 and a half. And then we go down now on the other end, where you just cross the 50. Half, let me say your most was 51. Half of 51 is what? 25.5. Right? So you notice the pattern that as you approach 100 with the most, the half would approach 50. Right? And on the other end, as close as you are to 50, let me say as you approach 50, then the half of that would be 25. We have a lot of technical language in there for some of the things that I discussed, but I'm leaving that out of the conversation because I don't want to go overboard with the mathematical jargon, right? But people who deeper into it would see what I'm talking about and start to think about it. But we try to make it for everybody, so let me make it easier now, right? So if the most is 50 to 100, then it makes sense that half of the most would be from 25 to 50, which is to say, you divide the lower extreme by 2, that is half, to get 25, and you divide the upper limit by 2 also, that's half, and you get 50. So in other words, if we are talking about the whole, then the most would be from 50 to 100, and then half of that most will be from 25 to 50. Alright? So it could be, well, we have an example here where half of the most you had to cross the 25 line. You had to cross 25 to get into the realm of half of the most. Right? Actually, no. I'll clarify that just now. But anyway, at 50, your half is 25. That is half. So once you cross 50, your half will also cross 25. You see? So this region in black, you must be greater than 25 because this region had to be greater than 50. So if this region in blue is greater than 50 and less than 100, then this region in black here would be greater than 25 but less than 50. So it will be between here and here. Right? So this is half. Sorry, not here. This is the most. Half of this would be this. So some general quantity, which is the most, we take half of that and we end up here. So let us now consider explicitly this quantity in black where we're talking about half of the most. Right? Can half of the most possibly be the most? Well, if we are speaking about the most of this whole here, the answer is very clearly no. Because any most that you could conceive of between 50 and 100, half of that could never be the most. Because by definition, the upper limit would not even reach 50 because you have to be less than 50. So half of the most, the highest it could possibly be is 50. Let me use 50 just to be simple, right? And at 50, you're still not the most of anything, because at 50, you are exactly equal. So we're discussing the general idea, and then we had to get technical now when we start to get down into the fine points of the thing. You see? So as close as you could get to 50, you're still not the most. Right? Now, that logic applies here as well, in this little corner, because somebody somewhere will say, well, all right, you might never be the most of this. We accept that. But how about if half of the most is actually the most of the most? Right? Which is to say that half of the most is the most of this little portion in blue here. Alright? So we know the portion in black could never be the most of the whole thing. We accept that. But can this portion in black possibly be the most of this? Which is to say, more than half. If you are half of anything, you can't be most of the thing. Right? If you're at half, that is as close as you will ever be to being the most, if you do become more than half. So in other words, if by definition you are half of the most, then there's no way that you could be the most of the most. See where I'm going with it? Because to be the most, you have to be greater than a half. And if you're equal to a half, you're not greater than a half. So you can't be the most. Right? So even though we may be tempted, for the sake of argument, if we're considering just this part in blue here, when they say, well, can half of this be the most of this? No, you can't be the most if you're just half. You cannot be the most if you're just half. So, as tempting as it might be to consider, from a pure mathematical standpoint, absolutely not. Alright? So no. The simple answer is half of the most cannot be the most. And if you extend it to any kind of situation where you have the most of anything and you have half of that most, no matter how you bend it, and I feel some level of confidence in saying this until or unless shown otherwise, half of the most cannot be the most. Alright? So I just took this time to just discuss this a little bit. And as I said, the only reason why I did this is because the more I thought about it, the more I realized, nah, somebody somewhere will take this and run with it. And I'm talking about mathematically run with it, not art, maths. And they will come to argue, right? And try to show you that half of the most could be the most. Alright? So even though we're not taking the statement seriously as coming from Mr. Alexander, because it was clear that he was saying that with a certain level of mirthful intent. How do you like that? That sounds like a calypso. Yeah. He was saying it with a certain level of intent to provoke laughter. Right? And we enjoy the statement. We enjoy it. But somebody somewhere will take it serious and then they'll run with that. And that you never know. Alright? So that's it for now. Right? We talk about the thing, we discuss the thing, and we're done. So let's take care, keep good, stick around. We have plenty more things coming up.